They call me a goddess, a seductress, a queen of kings. History has painted me in gold and blood, freezing my image as a statue of cold ambition. But before the legends were written, before the world trembled at my name, I was simply a young woman standing on the edge of a blade. I was an exile in my own land, hunted by my own blood, with the shadow of Rome looming over everything I loved. To save my life and protect my people, I had to do the impossible. I had to conquer the heart of the most powerful man on earth. This is not just a story of power. It is the truth of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, the love that changed history. I am Cleopatra VII Philopator. In your tongue, that name means she who loves her father. But titles are heavy things, often heavier than the gold crowns we wear. Tonight, I ask you to set aside the marble busts you have seen in museums. Forget the caricature of the temptress with coal-rimmed eyes plotting destruction. Instead, sit with me here, by the banks of memory. Let me tell you how it truly felt to hold the weight of an empire in hands that were still trembling with youth. I want you to imagine the heat of Egypt, not the pleasant warmth of a summer afternoon, but a heat that radiates from the earth itself, a living thing that shapes our days. I was born to this heat in the glorious city of Alexandria. It was the jewel of the Mediterranean, a city of white marble and limestone, where the lighthouse, the Pharos, pierced the sky, guiding ships from all over the known world. We were the center of knowledge, of culture, of civilization. The Library of Alexandria was my playground. While other princesses played with dolls, I played with mathematics, astronomy, and the philosophy of the Greeks. I learned to speak 9 languages because I believed that a queen who cannot speak to her people is no queen at all. I wanted to hear the grievances of the farmers in the Nile Delta in their own tongue, not through a translator who might twist their words. I loved them. I truly did. But love, I learned quickly, is rarely enough to secure a throne. My story, this chapter of it, begins in the year 48 before the Common Era. I was 21 years old. I should have been ruling from the palace, sitting upon the throne of the Ptolemies. Instead, I was sitting in a tent, surrounded by a harsh, dusty wind, near the fortress of Pelusium on the eastern border of Egypt. I was an exile, a fugitive. The enemy I faced was not a foreign invader, but my own brother, Ptolemy XIII. He was only a boy, barely 13 years old, a child who should have been learning statecraft at my knee. But the minds of children are easily molded by ambitious men. He was merely a puppet. The strings were pulled by a trio of vipers: Pothinus, the eunuch who whispered poison in his ear; Theodotus, the rhetorician who justified their cruelty; and Achilles, the general who commanded the army that should have been mine. These men did not care for Egypt. They cared for power. They had turned my brother against me, driving me out of Alexandria, stripping me of my birthright. They wanted me dead because they knew I was not a puppet. They knew I read the tax reports. They knew I understood the movement of grain and gold. They knew I could not be controlled. So there I was, camped in the desert with a ragtag army of mercenaries, looking across the sands toward the lines of my brother's vast army. The situation was dire. My coin was running low. My soldiers were restless. I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach every morning when I woke, wondering if this would be the day an assassin's knife finally found its mark between my ribs. I had to project strength. I walked among my men with my head high, my voice steady. But inside, I was a young woman who missed the smell of the sea and the safety of her library. And then the world broke open. News arrived on the wings of terrified messengers. The civil war in Rome, that giant hungry wolf across the sea, had spilled onto our shores. Pompey the Great, a Roman general who had once been a friend to my father, had fled to Egypt seeking sanctuary after losing a war against his rival, and that rival was following him. Julius Caesar. The name alone made the ground tremble. Caesar was the conqueror of Gaul, the man who had brought the Roman Republic to its knees. He was 52 years old, a seasoned wolf of war, brilliant, ruthless, and terrifying. My brother's advisors, in their cowardly panic, made a terrible mistake. Thinking they could curry favor with Caesar, they murdered Pompey the moment he stepped onto Egyptian sand. They cut off his head and presented it to Caesar when he arrived in Alexandria, thinking he would be pleased. He was not pleased. He was a Roman, and to see a fellow Roman general butchered by foreign treacherous servants disgusted him. He seized the royal palace in Alexandria, my palace, and demanded that Ptolemy and I dissolve our armies and submit to his arbitration. This was the moment, the hinge upon which history would turn. My brother held the city. His army surrounded the palace where Caesar was staying. I was stuck out in the desert, miles away. If I tried to enter Alexandria, my brother's guards would kill me on sight. Pothinus had spies everywhere. There was a blockade on land and sea. But I knew one thing. I had to meet Julius Caesar. I knew that if I could just speak to him, if I could look him in the eye, I could convince him. Not with feminine wiles, though I knew the power of my own charm, but with intellect. I needed to show him that a child king controlled by corrupt advisors was bad for Rome and bad for Egypt. I needed to show him that I was the only stable choice. But how? How does a queen in exile cross enemy lines, bypass an army of thousands, sneak into a palace under siege, and gain an audience with the most dangerous man alive? The sun was setting over the desert, casting long, bloody shadows across the dunes. I looked at the horizon, calculating the risks. If I failed, I would be executed, my head would be put on a spike, and my dynasty would crumble into dust. But if I stayed in the desert, I would wither away, and Egypt would be swallowed by Rome. I made my choice. I called for my most trusted friend, a Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus. He was a man of the sea, strong and clever. I told him my plan. I saw his eyes widen in disbelief, and then a slow smile spread across his face. It was madness. It was suicide. It was the only way.
We prepared a small boat. We waited for the darkest hour of the night. I left my army behind, taking only my wits and my courage. I was about to walk into the lion's den, unarmed, with nothing to protect me but a roll of fabric and the fire burning in my soul. I did not know then that I was sailing toward a love that would consume us both, a passion that would birth an empire and destroy a republic. All I knew was that I was Cleopatra, and I would not go down without a fight. The water of the Mediterranean is different at night. It is black, oily, and cold, reflecting nothing but the stars and the fear in your own heart. We were in a small fishing skiff, a vessel so humble it would usually be ignored by the massive warships patrolling the harbor. But tonight, humility was our only armor. I sat huddled in the stern, wrapped in a dark cloak that scratched against my skin. The salt spray stung my face, mixing with the cold sweat of anticipation. Across from me sat Apollodorus. Let me tell you about Apollodorus. If you ever find yourself needing to steal a kingdom back, find a man like him. He was a Sicilian, a man of the sea, with skin weathered like old leather and hands that were scarred from ropes and sword hilts. He was not a courtier, he did not know which fork to use at a banquet, and he did not care about the proper honorifics for a deity. But he possessed a loyalty that gold could not buy. He was broad-shouldered, with a thick beard that hid a jaw and iron, and eyes that constantly scanned the horizon, sharp and calculating. He rode with a silent, rhythmic power, his breathing steady, while I felt as though I couldn't breathe at all. Ahead of us, the great harbor of Alexandria loomed. It was a sight that usually filled me with pride, but that night it looked like the mouth of a beast waiting to swallow us. The Pharos lighthouse, the wonder of the world, sliced through the darkness with its massive beam of fire and mirrors, illuminating the waves. Every time the light swept near us, I shrank lower into the boat. If the harbor patrol spotted us, if they recognized the profile of their exiled queen, I would be dead before I reached the shore. My brother, Ptolemy, or rather his puppet masters, had placed a blockade on the palace. No one went in or out without their permission. "We are close, Domina," Apollodorus whispered. His voice was gravel, a low rumble that barely carried over the wind. "The palace docks are ahead, but the guards are thick as flies." This was the first challenge, the needle we had to thread. I needed to get inside the palace, past the Roman guards Caesar had posted, and past the Egyptian guards my brother controlled. Walking in was impossible. I needed to be invisible. We guided the boat into the shadows of the royal seawall. The stone was slick with algae and smelling of brine and dead fish. This was the back door to my own home. I looked up at the palace walls, high, imposing, impenetrable. This place which I had designed and decorated, where I had studied scrolls and debated scholars, was now a fortress holding the one man who could save me. "The sack," Apollodorus said, gesturing to the bottom of the boat. History likes to say it was a carpet, a beautiful, ornate Persian rug fit for a queen. It makes for a lovely painting, doesn't it? But reality is rarely so glamorous. It was a bed sack, a long, sturdy bag of coarse linen used to transport bedding and laundry. It was dusty, it smelled of stale lavender and raw wool, and it was my carriage. "Are you ready?" he asked, holding the mouth of the sack open. There was no mockery in his eyes, only a grim seriousness. I stood up, shaking off my cloak. I was dressed in my finest tunic, a shimmering silk of deep indigo, pinned with gold clasps in the shape of the cobra, the uraeus. I had braided pearls into my hair and applied the scent of kaifi, my signature perfume of frankincense, myrrh, and cinnamon. I needed to look like a queen the moment I emerged, even if I arrived like laundry. "I am ready," I said, though my voice trembled slightly. I stepped into the sack. It was humiliating, it was terrifying, to lower myself, the living Isis, into a bag like common goods. Apollodorus pulled the fabric up over my head. The world went dark. The sounds of the harbor were muffled. I felt the drawstring tighten above me, leaving only a tiny gap for air. Then the sensation of being lifted. Apollodorus hoisted me over his shoulder as if I weighed nothing. I hung there, upside down, blood rushing to my head, swaying with his heavy steps. I could hear his sandals slapping against the wet stone of the dock. Then, voices. "Halt!" a voice barked in Latin, rough, imperious, a Roman sentry. My heart stopped. I held my breath, my hands clutching the fabric from the inside. "Delivery for the general," Apollodorus grunted, his Latin thick with a Sicilian accent. "Bedding. He requested soft linens." "At this hour?" the guard asked, suspicious. I felt a hand poke the side of the sack. It missed my ribs by an inch. I bit my lips so hard I tasted copper. "Great men work late," Apollodorus replied, his voice bored, dismissive. "Do you want to be the one to tell Caesar he has to sleep on the stone floor because you stopped his laundry?" A pause, a terrifying, eternal silence. Then a grunt. "Go on, but make it quick." We were in. The walk seemed to last forever. I counted Apollodorus's steps to keep from screaming. The air grew warmer, the smell of the sea replaced by the scent of beeswax candles and polished cedar. We were inside the palace. I knew these hallways. I knew the echo of the marble floors. We were heading toward the royal apartments, my apartments, now occupied by the Roman consul.
Finally, the motion stopped. I felt myself being lowered, not gently, but with a heavy thud onto a floor. "What is this?" A new voice. A voice I had heard only in my nightmares and my hopes. It was a high, thin voice, calm but commanding. It was a voice used to giving orders that resulted in the deaths of thousands. "A gift, Imperator," Apollodorus said, "for your eyes only." I felt the drawstring loosen, the sack was pulled away. I did not scramble out, I did not crawl. I rose. I unfolded myself from the linen like a lotus flower opening to the sun. I stood up, smoothed my silk tunic, raised my chin, and looked directly into the eyes of Julius Caesar. The room was vast, illuminated by the flickering light of a dozen oil lamps. Piles of scrolls and maps cluttered the tables, and there he stood, Gaius Julius Caesar. He was not what I expected. He was older than the statues suggested. At 52, his hairline was receding. I noticed he combed his thinning hair forward to hide it, a vanity that made him strangely human. He was tall for a Roman, lean and wiry, with a neck that looked too thin to support the weight of his head. He wore a simple white tunic with the purple border of a senator, loose and comfortable. But his eyes were black, bottomless pools of intelligence. They were the eyes of a predator who had just been surprised in his own den. He looked at me, then at the sack on the floor, then back at me. His hand hovered near a dagger on his desk. "I am Cleopatra," I said. My voice was steady, resonant. I spoke in Greek, the language of our court, but then I switched to Latin, flawless, aristocratic Latin. "Queen of Egypt, and I believe you are sitting in my chair." A silence stretched between us, thick as honey. I saw the shock register on his face, followed by something else. Amusement? Admiration? He slowly took his hand away from the dagger. A smile, crooked and charming, tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Most guests use the door, Your Majesty," he said. "Most guests are not being hunted by their own army," I replied, stepping closer. I needed to assess him quickly. I knew his reputation, a womanizer, a spender, a brilliant tactician, a man of ruthless ambition. But I also saw the lines of fatigue around his mouth. He was tired. He was in a foreign land, surrounded by enemies, with a civil war back home and a local skirmish brewing outside his window. He didn't need a lover right now. He needed an ally. "You are bold," he said, walking around the desk to inspect me. He wasn't looking at me with lust. Not yet. He was looking at me like a general inspecting a new weapon. "To come here alone? Pothinus would have your head if he knew." "I am not alone," I said, locking eyes with him. "I am the Nile. I am the daughter of the sun. The people know me. I speak their language. I worship their gods. To my brother, Egypt is a purse to be stolen from. To me, Egypt is my body, my blood. Put me on the throne, Caesar, and you will not have a vassal state. You will have a partner who can fund your wars and feed your people." The air in the room shifted. It was no longer just a meeting, it was a negotiation, a dance. I saw the calculation in his eyes. He realized that the woman standing before him was not just a pretty face wrapped in a rug. He saw a mirror of himself, ambition recognizing ambition. But there was danger, too. The macro challenge, the great war for my throne, was far from won. My brother still had an army of 20,000 soldiers surrounding the palace. Caesar had barely 4,000 legionaries with him. We were trapped in this palace together. "If I support you," Caesar said, softly, stepping closer, close enough that I could smell the scent of parchment and iron on him, "it means war.
Civil war in the streets of Alexandria. Can you stomach that, little queen? I didn't flinch. I was born for it. He laughed then, a dry, genuine laugh. I believe you were. That night the alliance was forged, not in a bed, though that would come, but in a meeting of minds. We spent hours talking. He told me of Rome, of the Senate's treachery. I told him of the Ptolemies, of the burden of divinity. We drank wine and ate figs as the sun began to rise over the harbor. But outside the palace walls, the city was waking up, and when the sun rose, my brother would find out I was here. The real battle was about to begin. I had won entry into the lion's den, but now the lion and I had to fight off the hyenas together. The morning sun over Alexandria is usually a blessing, a golden hand that wakes the city. But the morning after I emerged from the sack, the sun rose like an accusing eye. The secret was out. I was in the palace.
Let me paint you a picture of my brother. He was 13 years old, a boy with the soft, unblemished skin of someone who has never known a day of labor. He wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, which looked too heavy for his slender neck. His eyes were wide, rimmed with kohl, but they held no wisdom, only a petulant, spoiled fury. He looked at Caesar, the wolf of Rome, and then at me, his sister and wife by custom, his enemy by choice. He did not negotiate, he did not strategize, he screamed. It was a child's tantrum on an imperial scale. He tore the royal diadem from his head and threw it to the floor. He ran out of the palace shouting to his guards, shouting to the mob gathering at the gates, screaming that he had been betrayed. "The Romans have stolen your queen! They have stolen your country!" he wailed. It worked. The city of Alexandria is a living beast, prone to sudden, violent moods. The mob, fueled by the lies of Pothinus, surged toward the palace walls. We were no longer guests, we were prisoners. The siege of Alexandria had begun. This brings us to the great paradox of those months. Outside the walls, there was blood, fire, and starvation. Inside, in the heart of the danger, I was living the most exhilarating days of my life. We were trapped in the royal quarters, a complex of opulent buildings, gardens, and temples. Caesar had only 4,000 men, his personal legion. My brother's general, Achilles, marched on us with 20,000 soldiers and a fleet of warships. The odds were laughable. By all logic, we should have been slaughtered within the week. But we had something they did not. We had Caesar's tactical genius, and I had my knowledge of the city. I remember standing on the balcony of the royal quarters, looking out at the chaos. Caesar stood beside me. He had traded his senator's toga for his general's armor, a breastplate of molded leather and bronze, a scarlet cloak that snapped in the wind. He was calm, unnervingly calm. "They are cutting off the aqueducts," I told him, pointing to the south. "They know the palace cisterns will run dry in 2 days. They intend to thirst us out." Caesar didn't look at the aqueducts. He looked at the sea. "Then we will drink from the ocean," he said. He ordered his engineers to dig wells deep into the beach sand, filtering the seawater until it was sweet enough to drink. He turned sand into water. That was the moment I fell in love with his mind. It was a machine that saw solutions where others saw only death. But war demands terrible prices, and this is where the shadow falls over my story. To break the blockade in the harbor, Caesar made a ruthless decision. My brother's fleet was docking, threatening to cut off our escape route. Caesar ordered the ships to be set on fire. I watched from the roof as the torches were thrown. The dry wood of the triremes caught instantly. The flames jumped from ship to ship, a dancing orange demon devouring the harbor. But the wind is a traitor. The flames jumped from the ships to the docks, and from the docks to the warehouses, and from the warehouses to the library. The great library,
the soul of Alexandria, the repository of all human knowledge. Scrolls written by Aristotle, Plato, Homer, centuries of wisdom, medicine, astronomy, poetry. I stood there, frozen, watching the black smoke billow into the blue sky. I could smell it. It wasn't just the smell of burning wood, it was the smell of burning history. It smelled like old skin and dry leaves. I felt tears streaming down my face, hot and angry. I turned to Caesar. "You are burning my city," I hissed. "You are burning the world's memory." He looked at the fire, his face grim, illuminated by the orange glow. "I am saving our lives, Cleopatra. Books can be rewritten. We cannot." It was a cold, Roman answer. It broke my heart, but I knew he was right. That was the moment I understood the difference between a scholar and a ruler. A scholar weeps for the scroll. A ruler weeps for the victory, no matter the cost. We retreated deeper into the palace. The fire raged, but we survived. In the midst of this destruction, our bond deepened. We were the golden couple, but not because of parties or luxury. We were partners in survival. We spent our nights over maps. I taught him the politics of the Egyptian court, who could be bribed, who was loyal, which priests held the sway of the people. He taught me the brutality of Roman warfare. He was 52 and I was 21. People whisper about the age gap. They call it perverse, but they do not understand power. When I looked at Caesar, I didn't see an old man. I saw a titan. And when he looked at me, he didn't see a child. He saw a queen who could match his intellect step for step. We would eat dinner on silver platters while arrows rattled against the shutters. We made love with the urgency of people who might die before sunrise. It was a passion born of adrenaline. He was fascinated by my culture. I introduced him to the cult of Isis. I showed him that a ruler in the East is not just a magistrate, but a god. I think he liked that idea, perhaps too much. But the noose was tightening. We had solved the water problem, and we had burned the enemy fleet, but we were still outnumbered 5-1. The secondary problem arose, more dangerous than the first: the island of Pharos. The great lighthouse stood on an island connected to the mainland by a long causeway, the Heptastadium. If my brother's forces took the lighthouse, they would control the harbor completely. We would be starved out.
Caesar decided to lead an attack to capture the causeway. It was a disaster. I watched from the palace tower as Caesar, the invincible god of war, was driven back. His soldiers panicked. They were pushed to the edge of the mole, falling into the sea. I saw Caesar, my Caesar, wearing his purple general's cloak, being surrounded. He was trapped on the edge of the dock. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. If he died there, I was finished. I would be dragged through the streets and torn apart by the mob. Then I saw him do something legendary. He threw off his purple cloak, the symbol of his rank, the target for every arrow, and dove into the water. The man who ruled Rome swam for his life, dodging spears and arrows, swimming hundreds of yards to a friendly ship. He returned to the palace later that evening, dripping wet, shivering, humbled, but alive. He had lost the battle for the causeway. He had lost hundreds of men. I met him in the hallway. I didn't offer him pity. Romans hate pity. I handed him a towel and a goblet of wine. "You lost the cloak," I said quietly. He wiped his face, his eyes burning with a cold, renewed fury. "I will get another one. But we need an army, Cleopatra. We cannot hold this palace forever. We are rats in a trap." This was the turning point. The clever tricks were done. The wells, the fires, the skirmishes, they were just delaying the inevitable. We had solved the minor problems of survival, but the macro challenge remained. We were locked in a stalemate, and time was on my brother's side. We needed a miracle. We needed an army to march from the east to break the siege. But who would come for us? Who would march into the jaws of death for a Roman general and an exiled queen? We sent messengers out in the dead of night, swimming under water to bypass the blockade, desperate pleas to Mithridates of Pergamum, a warrior king in the east. And so we waited. Weeks turned into months. The food supplies dwindled. The palace, once a place of music and perfume, now smelled of unwashed bodies and fear. But in that darkness, carrying the weight of the war, I felt a new sensation, a sickness in the mornings, a fatigue that was not just from stress. I placed my hand on my stomach. I carried the blood of the Ptolemies and the blood of Caesar, a child, a bridge between East and West. I looked at Caesar, who was pacing the room, staring at the horizon, waiting for a sail, waiting for dust on the horizon that would signal salvation. If we die here, I whispered to myself, we die together, but if we live, we will rule everything. The siege was grinding us down. The enemy was preparing a final assault on the palace gates. We had nowhere left to run. The rhythmic, thunderous marching of feet and the distant clash of metal. We were suffocating. The air in the palace had become stale, recycled breath shared by thousands of desperate men. We had survived the fires, the thirst, and the assassins, but survival is not victory. My brother's army was tightening the noose. Every morning I would climb to the highest tower and look out to the city I loved, seeing only the glint of enemy spears. We were an island in a sea of hatred. Caesar, the great tactician, was pacing like a caged tiger. He knew, and I knew, that we could not hold out for another week. The macro challenge, the war for the throne, the war for our very lives, seemed impossible to win. We were checkmated. Then the wind shifted. It began as a rumor, a whisper carried by a spy who swam under the chain boom of the harbor. Dust on the horizon to the east, a banner rising from the desert. Mithridates of Pergamum had come. He was a warrior king from the east, loyal to Caesar, and he had marched an army across the sands of Sinai, storming through the border fortress of Pelusium, the very place where I had been exiled. He was marching toward the Nile Delta with reinforcements. The game board flipped in an instant. My brother's generals made a fatal error. They turned their army away from the palace to meet this new threat. They thought they could crush Mithridates before turning back to finish us. Caesar saw the opening. I will never forget the look in his eyes that morning. The fatigue vanished. The age vanished. He was 20 years younger, energized by the smell of blood and opportunity. "We move now," he told me. He took his fleet, loaded his legions, and sailed out of the harbor, looping around to join forces with Mithridates. He left me in Alexandria to hold the palace. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, watching his ships disappear, not knowing if he would return, not knowing if the father of the child growing inside me would live to see his son. The Battle of the Nile was not fought on a clean, open field. It was fought in the mud, the reeds, and the chaos of the delta. I was not there to hold a sword, but I saw it through the reports that flew back to me on the wings of pigeons and swift boats. Caesar used the terrain against them. He outmaneuvered my brother's vast, clumsy army. The Roman legions, disciplined and brutal, stormed the Egyptian camp. And then came the moment that haunts me still. The end of the war. The end of my brother.
Ptolemy XIII was 13 years old. He was a boy who loved gold more than wisdom. When the battle turned against him, his advisors, those cowards Pothinus and Theodotus, fled. My brother tried to escape on a barge crossing the Nile, but the panic was too great. Too many men tried to climb onto the boat. It capsized. They say he was wearing his full ceremonial armor, gold breastplate, heavy greaves, the weight of a kingdom he was never fit to rule. He fell into the dark, silt-heavy waters of the Nile. The river he claimed to own pulled him down. He drowned in the mud, weighted down by his own vanity. When they found his body and brought his golden corselet to Caesar as proof, I did not cheer. I stood in the palace, looking at the empty throne, and I felt a cold grief. He was my enemy, yes. He would have killed me without hesitation, but he was my blood. The price of a crown is always paid in the blood of kin. I was now the sole ruler of Egypt. The macro challenge was solved, but the victory felt heavy. Caesar returned to Alexandria not just as a survivor, but as a conqueror. The city that had rioted against him now threw open its gates in fear and awe. But I did not let him act like a conqueror. I needed him to be a partner. I needed the people of Egypt to see that I had not sold them to Rome, but that Rome had bowed to Egypt. So I invited him on a journey. This is the part of the story that historians call the Nile Cruise. They paint it as a scandalous, hedonistic holiday. They say we abandoned our duties to float down the river in a loveboat. They are fools. They do not understand the theater of power. I commissioned the Thalamagos. It was not a boat. It was a floating palace, 300 feet long, 2 stories high. It had colonnades of cypress wood, floors of alabaster, shrines to Aphrodite and Dionysus, and bedrooms hung with purple silk. We sailed south, up the Nile, toward the heart of Egypt. We were accompanied by 400 ships, a massive display of military might, but also a religious procession. I wanted Caesar to see my world. I wanted him to understand what he had allied himself with. In Rome, power is brutal. It is brick and iron. In Egypt, power is divine. It is stone and eternity. We stood on the deck as we passed the pyramids of Giza, ancient even then. I saw Caesar, the man who thought he ruled the world, fall silent before them. I showed him the temples of Karnak and Luxor, the colossal statues of Ramesses. I showed him a civilization that had been standing for 3,000 years before Rome was even a village of mud huts. "This is my inheritance," I told him, my hand resting on my swelling stomach, "and it will be the inheritance of our child." Yes, by then there was no hiding it. I was pregnant with his son. The intimacy of those weeks was profound. We were away from the Senate, away from the spies. We talked of a new world order. Caesar began to see a vision that I planted in his mind, a universal kingdom. Why should the world be divided into East and West? Why not one empire united by our blood? He, the king of Rome in all but name, I, the queen of Egypt, and our son, the heir to it all. It was a seductive dream. It was hubris. The Greeks call it hate, the ruinous pride that invites the wrath of the gods. But on that boat, under the stars of the desert, surrounded by the smell of lotus flowers and the silence of the river, we felt like gods ourselves. We reached the border of Ethiopia before his legions began to grumble. They were Romans. They missed their bread and their wine and their rough games. They did not like the strange, animal-headed gods of Egypt. They whispered that Caesar had been bewitched. So we turned back. The honeymoon ended when we docked in Alexandria. Reality returned with the weight of an anchor dropping. Caesar had to leave. The civil war in Rome was not over. The sons of Pompey were raising armies in Africa and Spain. He had stayed too long. He had given me 3 months of his life, an eternity for a man like him. The parting was not tearful. We were not children. We were monarchs. "I will send for you," he promised, holding my face in his hands. His palms were rough, a soldier's hands. "When Rome is settled, when I have crushed the last of the rebellion, you will come to Rome, and you will bring our son." He left me with 3 legions to protect my throne, not just to guard me, but to remind everyone that Cleopatra was under the protection of Caesar.
A few months later, in the heat of the summer, I gave birth.
It was a boy. I named him Ptolemy Caesar, but the Alexandrians, with their shark wit, called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. He had his father's energy, but my eyes. I held him in my arms, looking down at his small, fragile face, and I made a vow. "You will not just be a king," I whispered to him. "You will be the King of Kings." I had won my throne. I had secured the most powerful ally in the world. I had an heir who united the two greatest powers of the Mediterranean. I was 22 years old, and I had everything. But the wheel of fortune never stops turning. I looked north, across the sea, toward Rome. I knew my destiny was no longer in the sands of Egypt. It was in the marble halls of that cold wolf's den of a city. I had conquered Caesar. Now I had to conquer Rome. If Alexandria was a dream of gold and sea foam, Rome was a fist of brick and marble. I arrived in the autumn of 46 BC. I did not come alone. I brought my court, my servants, my astronomers, and most importantly, I brought our son, Caesarion. I came as a visiting monarch, an ally of the Roman people, but as my litter was carried through the streets, peering through the silk curtains, I did not see allies. I saw eyes filled with judgment. Rome is an ugly city. I say this not out of spite, but out of truth. Unlike the wide, planned avenues of Alexandria, Rome was a tangled maze of narrow, winding streets that smelled of sewage and unwashed bodies. It was loud, chaotic, and aggressive. But amidst the squalor, there was a raw, undeniable power. You could feel the pulse of the world beating here, driven by iron and will. Caesar installed me in his private villa across the Tiber River, in the Trastevere Gardens. It was a beautiful estate, filled with cypresses and statues, a little island of luxury separated from the noise of the city. But make no mistake, it was a gilded cage. I quickly learned that while Caesar ruled the battlefields, he did not rule the hearts of the Roman aristocracy. To them, I was not a queen. I was a scandal. I was the Egyptian woman. I was the witch who had enslaved their greatest general with magic potions and Eastern perversions. The senators' wives would visit me, their smiles tight and fake, their eyes scanning my robes, my jewelry, my hair. They wore heavy wool stolas, draping themselves in modesty while their husbands plundered the world. They looked at my silks, woven so fine they were almost transparent, and called me a whore behind their fans. But I saw the envy. I brought fashion, makeup, and culture to their drab lives. Within a month, half the noblewomen in Rome were copying my hairstyles, the melon bun at the nape of the neck. They hated me, but they wanted to be me. But fashion was trivial. The real danger was politics. Caesar was changing. The man I had met in Egypt, the brilliant tactician who slept on the ground with his soldiers, was vanishing. In his place was a man beginning to believe his own legend. He had been named dictator for 10 years. He wore the high red boots of the ancient kings of Rome, a symbol that made every Republican senator grind his teeth. He sat on a golden chair in the Senate. He was acting less like a first citizen and more like a pharaoh. And I fear I fueled that fire. The breaking point, the moment the whispers turned to sharpened knives, was the temple of Venus Genetrix. Caesar built a magnificent new forum, and in the center he raised a temple to Venus, the goddess of love, the mythical ancestor of his family, the Julii. It was a holy place, a place for the gods. One afternoon, Caesar took me there. He held my hand, leading me into the cool, incense-filled sanctuary. "Look," he said, pointing to the altar.
There, beside the statue of the goddess Venus, stood another statue. It was gold, it was beautiful, and it was me. I stared at my own golden likeness, standing equal to a Roman goddess in the heart of their holy city. My blood ran cold. "Caesar," I whispered, gripping his arm, "this is too much. They will not accept this. You are making me a living goddess in a city that hates kings." He laughed, waving his hand dismissively. "Let them talk. I am Caesar. I do what I please. You are the mother of my son. You belong among the gods." He was drunk on power. He couldn't see the hatred in the eyes of men like Cicero, the great orator who wrote nasty letters about me, complaining that I hadn't given him a promised gift of books. He couldn't see the quiet fury of Brutus, the son of his mistress, a man he treated like a son, who watched Caesar's ambition with growing horror. I tried to warn him. At night, in the villa, while Caesarion slept in his cradle, I would trace the lines of worry on Caesar's forehead. "You are called king in the streets, Julius," I told him, "and they spit when they say it. In Egypt, a king is a bridge to the divine. Here, a king is a tyrant to be killed." "I am not a king," he would insist, stubborn as a mule. "I am the dictator. I am restoring order. They need me." "They fear you," I countered, "and fear turns quickly to hate. Watch Brutus, watch Cassius. They are too quiet." But he wouldn't listen. He was planning a new war, a massive campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east. He wanted to leave Rome again. He wanted to take me and our son back to the east, to rule from Alexandria while he conquered the world. He spoke of a universal empire united under us. It was a dazzling dream, but dreams are fragile things in a city of steel. The date was approaching, the Ides of March.
The atmosphere in the city grew heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. The graffiti on the walls became more violent. "Brutus, are you sleeping?" was scrawled on the statues of ancestors. There are rumors of prophecies, of soothsayers warning him to beware. On the night of March 14th, the year 44 BC, we were together in the villa. He was distracted, sorting through papers for his upcoming departure to Parthia. I felt a sick dread in the pit of my stomach, an intuition honed by years of surviving my own family's treachery. "Stay here tomorrow," I said. "Do not go to the Senate. The omens are bad. Calpurnia has had nightmares." Calpurnia was his Roman wife, a woman I respected for her patience, though we never spoke. He looked at me, his eyes tired but defiant. "I cannot hide, Cleopatra. If I hide, they will say I am afraid. A Roman does not fear death. He only fears dishonor." He kissed me. It was a distracted kiss, a goodbye kiss, though neither of us admitted it. "I will see you in the afternoon," he said. "We will discuss the plans for Caesarion." He walked out of the villa into the morning mist. I watched him go, his red cloak disappearing into the gray fog. I looked down at little Caesarion, playing with a wooden horse on the floor. I didn't know it then, but the next time I saw Caesar, the dream would be over. The knives were already drawn. The wolves were waiting. The Ides of March, the 15th day. To the Romans it was a day of settling debts. To me it was the day the sky fell. I was in the gardens of the villa across the Tiber. The afternoon was gray, the air thick and unmoving. I was playing with Caesarion, rolling a ball across the grass, but my mind was in the Senate house. I kept looking at the sun, estimating the time. The session should have been over. Caesar should have been on his way back to me, perhaps complaining about a boring speech or laughing about a senator's bad toga. But the road remained empty. Silence is a terrible thing when you are waiting for the man who holds your life in his hands. The birds stopped singing, the wind died down. It felt as if the gods themselves were holding their breath. Then I heard it. Not a shout, but a wail, a low collective moan rising from the center of the city, across the river. It grew louder, like a wave of sound crashing against the banks. It was the sound of a city screaming. The gates of the villa burst open. It was not Caesar. It was a messenger, a young slave boy, his tunic torn, his face a mask of dust and tears. He collapsed at my feet, gasping for air. I didn't need him to speak. I looked at his hands. They were shaking violently. I looked at his eyes. They held the horror of someone who has seen the world end. "Domina," he choked out. "The king, the dictator." I grabbed his shoulders. "Speak," I commanded, though my own voice was a stranger to me. "Dead," he whispered. "They killed him. In the theater of Pompeii. They all had knives." The world tilted. I felt the ground lurch beneath my feet. I didn't scream. I didn't faint. Queens do not faint. Instead, a cold white numbness spread through my veins. It was as if I had turned to marble. "Who?" I asked. The word was a shard of glass in my throat. "All of them," the boy sobbed. "Casca, Cassius, Cimber." He paused, looking up at me with pity. "And Brutus, Marcus Brutus." Brutus, the man Caesar loved like a son, the man who had dined at his table. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. I stood up and walked to the edge of the terrace, looking toward the city. I imagined it then. I saw it as clearly as if I had been standing there. I saw Caesar sitting in his golden chair. I saw Tullius Cimber pulling at his toga, the signal. I saw the first blow strike his neck. I saw the wolf pack closing in, 23 men, 23 daggers plunging into the flesh of the man who had conquered the world. They say he fought back at first, like the lion he was, but when he saw Brutus, when he saw the face of the boy he loved holding a blade, he covered his face with his toga. He gave up. He died at the foot of the statue of Pompey, his old enemy. Irony is the favorite humor of the gods. 23 stab wounds. Only one was fatal, the physician later said, but the dream of the universal empire died with the first blow. I turned back to the garden. Caesarion was still holding the ball, looking at me with wide, confused eyes. He was 3 years old. He looked so much like his father. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the shock. "Get inside," I ordered my servants. "Bar the gates, arm the guards." The macro challenge, the dream of uniting Egypt and Rome through our marriage and our son, was not just broken, it was obliterated, and in its place, a new terrifying reality emerged. I was no longer the honored guest of the dictator. I was the foreign whore of a tyrant, and my son, my beautiful, innocent son, he was the living proof of Caesar's ambition. To the conspirators, to Brutus and Cassius, Caesarion was a threat. He was a blood heir in a republic that hated kings. "They will come for us," I whispered to myself. "They have killed the lion. Now they will want to kill the cubs." Night fell over Rome, but there was no sleep. The city was in anarchy. The conspirators were hiding on the Capitoline Hill, terrified of the mob. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant, had barricaded himself in his house. I sat in the dark, watching the torches flickering across the river. I realized then how alone I truly was.
I had no army here. I had no ships. I was trapped in the heart of enemy territory with the most hunted child in the world. Then came the final insult, the reading of the will. 2 days later, the contents of Caesar's will were made public. He left money to every Roman citizen. He left his gardens to the public. But the name of his heir, it was not Caesarion. It was his great-nephew, a sickly 19-year-old boy named Octavian.
Caesar had betrayed me from beyond the grave. He had chosen a Roman heir to appease the Roman people. He had left his own son with nothing, no title, no protection, no legacy. I felt a rage so hot it could have burned the villa to ash. I had gambled everything on Caesar. I had alienated my own people, emptied my treasury, and risked my life. And for what? To be a footnote? To be a widow with a bastard child? No. I looked at Caesarion, sleeping in my arms. I touched his cheek. "They think we are finished," I whispered to him. "They think without him we are nothing. They are wrong." The Roman game was lost. The board had been overturned. There was no victory to be found here, only death. The secondary problems, the insults, the politics, didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was survival. I had to get out. I had to get us back to the water, back to the source of my power. "Pack everything," I told Apollodorus. "We leave tonight." "But the roads are dangerous, Majesty," he warned. "The city is rioting." "I do not care about the roads," I snapped, my eyes flashing. "We are going home. Rome has taken my lover. It will not take my son." We were leaving the center of the world. We were running away, defeated, broken, and terrified. But as I clutched my son to my chest, I felt the old steel returning to my spine. I was Isis. I was the Nile, and I was still breathing. We fled Rome like thieves in the night. There were no trumpets to herald our departure, no crowds to throw flowers, just the muffled hooves of horses and the terrified breathing of my servants. As our ship pulled away from the port of Ostia, I stood on the stern, wrapped in a dark cloak, watching the coast of Italy recede into the black horizon. I left a piece of my soul in that city. I left the man who had taught me that the world was small enough to hold in the palm of a hand. Caesar was dust now, burned on a pyre in the Forum, his ashes scattered to the winds of a republic that did not deserve him. The journey back to Egypt was a funeral march on water. For weeks I sat by the rail, staring at the endless blue of the Mediterranean. The grief was a physical weight, a stone in my chest that made it hard to breathe. I thought of his laugh. I thought of his hands. I thought of the promises he made, promises that were now just words written on smoke. But as the days turned into weeks, the salt air began to clear my head. The tears stopped, and in the silence of the sea, the queen began to wake up. I looked at my son, Caesarion. He was the only thing that mattered now. Rome had rejected him. Caesar's will had ignored him. Octavian, that pale, sickly boy, was now the heir to the name of Caesar. But my son had the blood. He was the living legacy. And I realized that if Rome would not give him his birthright, I would have to build a world where he could take it. When the Pharos lighthouse finally appeared on the horizon, a pillar of white fire against the blue sky, I felt a surge of electricity. Home.
Alexandria, my city, my fortress. I stepped off the ship not as the broken widow of a Roman dictator, but as the living Isis returning to her temple. I walked down the gangplank, and when my feet touched the warm stone of the harbor, I felt the strength of the Nile rush back into my veins. The macro challenge, the dream of a unified empire through Caesar, was dead. That path was closed, but the story was not over. It had simply changed direction. I wasted no time. Sentimentality is a luxury for those who do not wear crowns. I solidified my power immediately. I elevated Caesarion to the throne beside me. We issued coins with his face, the face of a child king, the king of kings. I built temples. I filled the granaries. I made Egypt strong, wealthy, and independent. I watched from afar as Rome tore itself apart. The conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, were hunted down. The new leaders of Rome, Octavian and Mark Antony, divided the world between them. Mark Antony. I remembered him. He had been one of Caesar's generals, a man of immense physical presence, loud, boisterous, a lover of wine and women. He was not the intellectual that Caesar was. He was a force of nature, a man of passion. Reports came to me that Antony was taking control of the eastern provinces. He was summoning monarchs to meet him in Tarsus. He wanted to question me. He wanted to know if I had been loyal to Rome. I smiled when I read his summons. He thought he was calling a vassal to account. He thought he was calling a frightened widow to beg for mercy. He had no idea who was coming for him. I walked to my balcony one last time, looking out over the glittering harbor of Alexandria. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of violet and blood. I loved Caesar with my mind. We were a meeting of intellects, but the gods were shuffling the deck again. To survive the next chapter, to protect my son and my crown, I would need more than intellect. I would need fire. I would need spectacle. I would need to become the very goddess they feared. I turned to my servants. "Prepare the barge," I commanded, "the golden one with the purple sails, and bring the flutes, bring the incense." I looked north, towards Tarsus, towards the future. "Caesar is dead," I whispered to the wind. "Long live the queen." The dream of Caesar was over, but the legend of Cleopatra was just beginning. I had survived the lion's den, but now I had to tame a tiger. Mark Antony was waiting, and unlike Caesar, he wasn't looking for a partner in politics. He was looking for a partner in paradise. How did I turn a Roman summons into the greatest seduction in history? How did we almost bring Rome to its knees for the second time? You will have to find out in the next episode. If you enjoyed this journey through history, if you felt the sand of Egypt and the cold marble of Rome, please subscribe to the channel. Leave a like if you believe that a queen fights until the very end. I am Cleopatra, and my story continues.